In the fall of 1989, a young researcher named Elias decided to spend a month in a secluded cabin deep within the Blackwood National Forest. Elias was documenting the unusual decay patterns of the local timber, hoping to find a scientific explanation for the forest's dying heart. The cabin was a primitive, single-room structure made of heavy pine logs, miles away from the nearest Forest Service road. Armed with only a notebook, a handheld VHS camcorder, and a week's worth of supplies, Elias felt a sense of peace in the absolute isolation, unaware of the forest's ancient hunger. The first few days were productive, with Elias capturing hours of footage of the twisted, blackened trees that seemed to grow in unnatural spirals. However, on the fourth night, the silence was broken by a rhythmic, metallic, scraping sound coming from just outside the cabin walls. It sounded like a serrated blade being dragged across dry wood. Elias grabbed his camcorder and stepped onto the porch, the cold night air biting at his skin. He scanned the darkness with his flashlight, but the woods remained still. The only thing he found was a fresh, deep carving on the porch pillar. The carving was disturbing. It wasn't a symbol or a name, but a crude yet recognizable silhouette of Elias himself, captured in a sitting position. The detail was impossible for something done in a few minutes in total darkness. Elias felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine as he realized the mimic Carver had been watching him through the window. He locked the heavy oak door and pushed a dresser against it, his heart hammering against his ribs. The forest was no longer a place of study. It had become a gallery, and he was the subject. The next morning, Elias decided to leave, but his old truck refused to start. The engine wires had been meticulously stripped, not by an animal, but by something that understood machinery. As he walked back toward the cabin to gather his things, he noticed that the trees surrounding the clearing had changed overnight. Every single trunk now bore a fresh carving. Each one depicted Elias in different stages of distress, screaming, running, and even sleeping. The mimic Carver was documenting his fear, turning the very skin of the forest into a living record of Elias's slow mental collapse. Desperation set in as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the clearing. Elias barricaded himself inside the cabin, the only light coming from a single kerosene lamp that flickered precariously. He started recording his thoughts on the VHS tape, his voice trembling as he described the scratching sounds that were now coming from the roof. The entity wasn't just carving wood anymore. It was mimicking the sound of Elias's own heavy breathing, projecting it back at him from the corners of the dark room. He was being hunted by his own reflection. At 1 a.m., the scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural voice that sounded like grinding stones. It was calling his name, but the inflection was wrong, as if the entity was learning how to speak in real time. Elias, let me finish the portrait, the voice whispered through the floorboards. He looked down and saw a long, jagged blade of bone-white wood poking through the gaps in the wood. The carver was beneath the cabin, meticulously carving a life-sized image of Elias into the very foundation of the building. The structure was becoming part of the entity. The cabin began to groan and shift, as if the logs themselves were coming back to life. Elias watched in horror as the carvings on the walls began to move, the wooden silhouettes of himself shifting and turning their heads to watch him. The static on his camcorder intensified, the screen filled with horizontal tracking lines and distorted images of a tall, spindly figure with bark-like skin and long, needle-thin fingers. The mimic Carver didn't have a face, only a flat, wooden surface that changed shape to mimic whatever it looked at. It was the ultimate predator of identity. Suddenly, the kerosene lamp was knocked over, plunging the room into a terrifying, smoky darkness. Elias fumbled for his flashlight, but when he clicked it on, the beam revealed the Carver standing in the far corner. It was nearly 7 feet tall, its body made of gnarled, blackened roots and sharp wooden shards. It held a long, curved carving tool made from a human femur. As it stepped closer, the entity's wooden face began to ripple and shift, slowly forming a crude, terrifying version of Elias's own face, complete with unblinking, hollow eyes and a jagged mouth. Elias scrambled through the back window, the jagged glass tearing at his clothes as he tumbled into the cold, damp forest floor. He didn't look back, running blindly through the blackened trees, his breath coming in jagged gasps that echoed the Carver's own rhythmic movements. Every tree he passed seemed to reach out with its carved limbs, trying to trip him or snag his jacket. The forest was a maze of his own likeness, a gallery of wooden ghosts that watched his flight with silent, carved eyes. He was lost in a world made of his own image. He eventually found a small stone outcrop and huddled in a narrow crevice, praying for the dawn. But the forest was silent, the wind dying down to a haunting whisper. He heard the sound of the Carver approaching, not with heavy steps, but with the soft, wet sound of roots moving through soil. The entity stopped just outside his hiding spot. It didn't attack. It simply began to carve into the stone. The sound of bones scraping against rock was deafening in the still air. The Carver was patient. It had all the time in the world. When the sun finally broke through the dense canopy, Elias emerged from the crevice, his mind fractured by the night's terrors. He walked back to the cabin, driven by a strange, magnetic pull. The clearing was empty, and the cabin stood silent, its logs now covered in a dense layer of intricate, overlapping carvings. He entered the room and saw his camcorder sitting on the floor, the red recording light still blinking. He picked it up and played back the final minutes. The footage showed the Carver sitting in Elias's chair, holding the camera and filming its own transformation. The tape showed the entity's wooden skin softening and changing color, its jagged features smoothing out until it looked exactly like Elias. The only difference was the eyes, two solid, light-absorbing voids that reflected nothing. The mimic Carver had successfully stolen his form, leaving Elias as the hollow shell. He looked down at his own hands and saw them turning into gray, weathered wood. His skin was becoming bark, and his fingers were lengthening into sharp carving points. He was no longer the researcher. He was becoming the next Carver of the Blackwood Forest. Elias tried to scream, but his throat was now filled with dry sawdust and splintered wood. He felt his consciousness fading, being pushed into the deep, dark knots of the cabin's logs. He was becoming a permanent part of the gallery, a living carving that would watch the next traveler who dared to enter the woods. The transformation was agonizing and absolute. As the last of his humanity vanished, he felt a strange, new instinct, a hunger to find a new subject, to document a new fear, and to carve a new face. Months later, a forest ranger found the cabin during a routine patrol. The truck was still in the clearing, rusted and overgrown with vines. Inside the cabin, they found the VHS tapes and a single, life-sized wooden statue of a man sitting in the center of the room. The statue was so realistic that the ranger almost spoke to it, believing it to be a living person. But the eyes were just hollow knots in the wood, and the skin was cold and hard. They never found Elias, but the carvings in the forest seemed to have multiplied. The Blackwood cabin remained standing, though it is now cordoned off by the authorities as a site of an unexplained disappearance. Visitors to the surrounding woods often report hearing a rhythmic scratching sound at night, and some have found crude carvings of their own faces on the trees near their campsites. The mimic carver is still there, hidden in the grain of the wood, waiting for the next person to step into its gallery. Remember, if you find your face carved into a tree, don't run. The portrait is already finished, and he's coming to claim the original.